the 21st century dawned with a promise of interconnectedness. Globalization seemed inevitable, yet, amidst this apparent progress, the seeds of conflict were being sown. In Eastern Europe, a long simmering tension between Russia and Ukraine began to boil over. This conflict, rooted in history and fueled by geopolitical ambition, would soon erupt into a full-blown war. A war that would shatter the illusion of peace and redraw the map of Europe. The world watched in disbelief as tanks rolled across borders and missiles rained from the sky. The year was 2022, and the seemingly unthinkable had happened. A major war had broken out in Europe. This was not a conflict confined to history books. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of peace. The Russia-Ukraine War, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves across the globe. It triggered a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions, displaced millions, and reshaped the geopolitical landscape. This conflict, with its global implications, is a story that demands to be told, understood, and never forgotten. The initial shock of the invasion quickly gave way to a sobering realization. The world order, as we knew it, was irrevocably changed. The conflict in Ukraine was not merely a regional dispute. It was a clash of ideologies, a struggle for power, and a stark reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked aggression. The war's repercussions were felt far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. Global energy markets were thrown into turmoil as sanctions on Russia, a major energy producer, sent prices soaring. Supply chains, already strained by the COVID-19 pandemic, faced further disruptions. The specter of food insecurity loomed large, particularly in countries heavily reliant on grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. The conflict also had profound political consequences. It revitalized the NATO alliance, which had been facing questions about its relevance in recent years. European nations, once hesitant to increase military spending, embarked on significant defense buildups. The war, in many ways, marked the end of the post-Cold War era. To truly comprehend the complexities of the Russia-Ukraine war, one must delve into the annals of history. The two nations, intrinsically linked by geography, culture, and a shared past, have a relationship marked by both cooperation and conflict. For centuries, Ukraine, with its fertile lands and strategic location, found itself at the crossroads of empires. Incorporated into the Russian Empire in the 18th century, Ukraine experienced periods of Russification and suppression of its language and culture. The horrors of the Holodomor, a man-made famine engineered by Stalin's regime in the 1930s, left an indelible scar on the Ukrainian psyche. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 offered Ukraine a chance for self-determination. It declared its independence, a move ratified by a referendum in which a majority of Ukrainians, including many in the East, voted unequivocally for freedom. Yet, this newfound independence was not without its challenges. Ukraine and Russia, two nations intertwined by a tapestry of shared history, language, and culture, find themselves tragically pitted against each other on the world stage. To comprehend the depths of this conflict, one must journey back in time, to an era when their destinies were closely intertwined. For centuries, the vast expanse of Ukraine, with its fertile plains and strategic location, served as a bridge between Russia and Europe, shaping the cultural and historical identities of both nations. The cultural and linguistic kinship between Ukrainians and Russians runs deep, rooted in their shared Slavic heritage. The two languages, though distinct, share common roots and a considerable degree of mutual intelligibility. This linguistic proximity, however, has been a source of both connection and contention, with Russia often using it to assert cultural dominance and undermine Ukrainian national identity. Religious ties further cemented the bond between the two nations. The adoption of Orthodox Christianity by the Eastern Slavs in the 10th century left an enduring legacy, shaping their religious practices and worldviews. The Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox churches, while maintaining separate hierarchies, share a common theological tradition and historical lineage, a connection that continues to influence religious life in both countries. Despite these deep-seated connections, the relationship between Ukraine and Russia has been far from harmonious. The historical narrative is punctuated by periods of both cooperation and conflict, with Ukraine often caught in the geopolitical crosshairs of larger empires. This complex interplay of shared heritage and historical grievances forms the backdrop against which the current conflict unfolds. Section 2. The Crumbling Empire, Seeds of Discord. The 20th century ushered in an era of upheaval and transformation for both Ukraine and Russia. The Russian Empire, weakened by internal strife and external pressures, crumbled under the weight of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, forever altering the political landscape of Eastern Europe. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Ukraine declared its independence, seeking to forge its own path as a sovereign nation. This aspiration for self-determination, however, was short-lived. The nascent Ukrainian state, caught in the crossfire of civil war and foreign intervention, was ultimately subsumed into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet period was a time of both progress and repression for Ukraine. On the one hand, the Soviet government implemented policies aimed at industrialization and modernization, transforming Ukraine into a vital industrial and agricultural center within the USSR. Education and literacy rates soared, and a new urban working class emerged. On the other hand, Ukrainian national identity and culture faced systematic suppression under Stalin's brutal regime. The Holodomor, a man-made famine engineered by the Soviet government in the 1930s, decimated the Ukrainian peasantry, killing millions and leaving an enduring trauma etched in the nation's collective memory. Ukrainian language and culture were marginalized, while Russian language and culture were promoted, as part of a broader Soviet policy of cultural homogenization. Section 3. The Orange Revolution, a nation's aspirations. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a watershed moment in Ukrainian history, offering the nation a second chance at independence. A referendum held in December 1991 saw an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians across all regions vote decisively in favor of freedom and self-determination. Ukraine's path to democracy and prosperity, however, proved to be fraught with challenges. The legacy of Soviet economic mismanagement, coupled with widespread corruption and political instability, hindered the country's development. The tug-of-war between Russia and the West for influence over Ukraine further complicated matters, leaving the nation grappling with its geopolitical orientation. The Orange Revolution of 2004 marked a turning point in Ukraine's post-independence trajectory. This peaceful mass protest movement erupted following a fraudulent presidential election widely seen as rigged in favor of a pro-Russian candidate. Ukrainians from all walks of life took to the streets, demanding fair elections and a government accountable to its people. The Orange Revolution, though ultimately successful in securing a new election and a pro-Western government, exposed the deep divisions within Ukrainian society and the fragility of its democratic institutions. It also highlighted Russia's willingness to interfere in Ukrainian affairs to protect its perceived interests. Section 4. The Calm Before the Storm. Simmering Tensions. The years following the Orange Revolution were marked by a period of relative calm, but beneath the surface, tensions continued to simmer. Ukraine found itself torn between the allure of closer integration with the European Union and the historical and economic pull of Russia. In 2013, these simmering tensions boiled over when then-President Viktor Yanukovych, under intense pressure from Moscow, abruptly abandoned an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer economic ties with Russia. This decision ignited a wave of protests that would come to be known as the Euromaidan Revolution. The Euromaidan protests, initially driven by frustration over Yanukovych's U-turn on EU integration, quickly morphed into a broader movement demanding an end to corruption, government accountability, and a more democratic Ukraine. The protests were met with brutal force by the Yanukovych regime, resulting in the deaths of over 100 protesters. As the world watched in horror, the Ukrainian government's violent crackdown on peaceful protesters backfired spectacularly, galvanizing support for the opposition and further alienating Ukraine from Russia. The Euromaidan Revolution, far from being a mere protest movement, proved to be a pivotal moment in Ukrainian history, solidifying the nation's pro-European aspirations and setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. The Maidan Uprising, a nation's fury, ignited. The Euromaidan protests, sparked by Yanukovych's rejection of the EU association agreement, quickly transformed into a nationwide uprising, uniting Ukrainians from all walks of life in a collective demand for change. The protests, centered in Kyiv's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square, became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance and a focal point for global attention. The Maidan, as it came to be known, was more than just a protest site. It evolved into a microcosm of Ukrainian society, a testament to the people's determination to shape their own destiny. Students, teachers, doctors, workers, and artists from across the country converged on the square, braving freezing temperatures, police brutality, and the constant threat of violence. As the protests gained momentum, the Yanukovych regime resorted to increasingly brutal tactics in a desperate attempt to quell the uprising. Riot police, armed with water cannons, tear gas, and rubber bullets, clashed violently with protesters. Snipers, positioned on rooftops overlooking the Maidan, fired live rounds into the crowds, killing dozens of unarmed civilians. Despite the escalating violence and the ever-present threat to their lives, the protesters refused to back down. The Maidan became a crucible for Ukrainian national identity, forging a sense of unity and purpose that transcended regional and linguistic differences. The world watched in awe as ordinary Ukrainians, armed with nothing more than their convictions and a yearning for freedom, stood their ground against a corrupt and authoritarian regime. Crimea annexed, a land divided. As the Euromaidan protests raged in Kyiv, a parallel crisis was unfolding in Crimea, a strategically important peninsula on the Black Sea with a predominantly ethnic Russian population. Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, saw an opportunity to exploit the chaos and instability in Ukraine to advance its own geopolitical agenda. In late February 2014, unmarked Russian troops, armed with sophisticated military equipment, fanned out across Crimea, seizing control of key government buildings, military installations, and strategic infrastructure. The Ukrainian military, caught off guard and outmatched, offered little resistance. The international community condemned Russia's actions, recognizing the annexation of Crimea as a blatant violation of international law and a dangerous precedent in post-Cold War Europe. Western nations imposed sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, energy sector, and key individuals close to Putin. Despite widespread international condemnation, Russia remained defiant, formally annexing Crimea following a hastily organized referendum that was widely dismissed as illegitimate by the international community. The annexation of Crimea marked a turning point in East-West relations, ushering in a new era of geopolitical tensions and mistrust. War in the Donbass. The conflict ignites. The annexation of Crimea proved to be just the opening salvo in Russia's campaign to destabilize Ukraine and undermine its pro-Western government. In April 2014, armed separatists, backed by Russian troops, launched a coordinated insurgency in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, an area with a significant Russian-speaking population. The conflict in the Donbass, fueled by a potent mix of Russian propaganda, historical grievances, and geopolitical maneuvering, quickly escalated into a full-blown war. Ukrainian government forces, ill-prepared and outgunned, found themselves locked in a bitter struggle against battle-hardened separatists equipped with advanced Russian weaponry. The war in the Donbass exacted a heavy toll on the civilian population. Cities and towns across the region were reduced to rubble, their streets littered with the debris of war. Thousands of civilians were killed, caught in the crossfire, or targeted by indiscriminate shelling. Millions more were displaced from their homes, forced to flee for their lives. The international community watched with growing alarm as the conflict in eastern Ukraine festered, threatening to spill over into a wider European war. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis, led by France and Germany, resulted in a series of ceasefire agreements, but these proved fragile and easily broken. In an effort to halt the bloodshed and find a political solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, representatives from Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany met in the Belarusian capital of Minsk in September 2014. The resulting Minsk Protocol, signed by all parties, outlined a framework for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front lines, and constitutional reforms in Ukraine to grant greater autonomy to the Donbass region. The Minsk Accords, while hailed as a step towards peace, proved difficult to implement. Both sides accused each other of violating the ceasefire, and sporadic fighting continued along the line of contact. The issue of Ukrainian control over its eastern border with Russia, a key sticking point in the negotiations, remained unresolved. Despite its shortcomings, the Minsk process remained the only viable diplomatic track for resolving the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The Accords provided a framework for dialogue and a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution, however tenuous. The 2014 crisis in Ukraine sent shockwaves across the international community, shattering the post-Cold War order and exposing the fragility of peace in Europe. The annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass marked a turning point in East-West relations, ushering in a new era of geopolitical tensions and mistrust. The United States and its European allies responded to Russia's aggression with a combination of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and increased military support for Ukraine. NATO, once seen as a relic of the Cold War, experienced a resurgence, bolstering its presence in Eastern Europe and reaffirming its commitment to collective defense. The crisis in Ukraine also exposed the limitations of international law and institutions in the face of blatant aggression by a major power. The United Nations Security Council, paralyzed by Russia's veto power, proved unable to take decisive action to address the crisis. The 2014 crisis in Ukraine served as a wake-up call for the West, highlighting the re-emergence of Russia as a revisionist power willing to use military force to achieve its geopolitical objectives. The conflict also underscored the importance of transatlantic unity and the need for a robust and coordinated response to Russian aggression. February 24, 2022, will forever be etched in the annals of history as the day Russia shattered the fragile peace in Europe, launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine under the pretense of a special military operation. The world watched in disbelief as Russian tanks rolled across the border, their tracks leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Missiles rained down on cities across Ukraine, targeting military installations, government buildings, and civilian infrastructure. The initial hours of the invasion were marked by a sense of shock and disbelief. Many had dismissed the possibility of a full-scale invasion as mere saber-rattling by Putin, a desperate attempt to intimidate Ukraine and extract concessions from the West. The reality, however, proved to be far more ominous. Putin's gamble, it seemed, was based on the assumption that Ukraine would crumble quickly, its defenses overwhelmed by the sheer might of the Russian military. As dawn broke over Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, the sounds of explosions echoed through the streets, shaking residents from their sleep. The city, once a vibrant hub of Eastern European life, was transformed into a war zone. Overnight, long lines of cars snaked their way out of the city, their occupants desperate to escape the impending onslaught. Those who remained huddled in basements and bomb shelters, their lives upended by the sudden and brutal reality of war. The world watched in horror as the events of that fateful day unfolded. The images of Russian tanks, fighter jets, and helicopter gunships seared into the collective memory. The invasion of Ukraine was not just an attack on a sovereign nation. It was an assault on the very foundations of the international rules-based order, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the 21st century. Contrary to Putin's calculations, Ukraine did not collapse. Instead, the Russian invasion was met with fierce resistance from both the Ukrainian military and ordinary citizens, who took up arms to defend their homeland. The spirit of defiance that had been forged during the Maidan Revolution was reignited, uniting Ukrainians from all walks of life in a common struggle for survival. In the early days of the invasion, as Russian forces advanced on Kiev from multiple directions, many feared that the Ukrainian capital would fall within days. However, the Ukrainian military, bolstered by years of Western training and equipped with increasingly sophisticated weaponry, mounted a spirited defense, inflicting heavy casualties on the invading forces. Ordinary citizens played a crucial role in the defense of Kyiv, forming territorial defense units, building barricades, and providing logistical support to the Ukrainian army. Videos of Ukrainian grandmothers making Molotov cocktails and farmers towing away captured Russian tanks went viral on social media, capturing the world's imagination and becoming potent symbols of Ukrainian resistance. The siege of Kiev lasted for several weeks, during which time the city endured relentless bombardment by Russian artillery and airstrikes. Despite the constant threat of death and destruction, the spirit of the Ukrainian people remained unbroken. Their resilience and determination, in the face of overwhelming odds, would come to define the early days of the war. While the battle for Kiev raged, the strategic port city of Mariupol, located on the Sea of Azov in southeastern Ukraine, became a focal point of the Russian offensive. Russian forces, determined to capture the city and establish a land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass region, subjected Mariupol to a relentless bombardment, trapping hundreds of thousands of civilians in a living nightmare. The siege of Mariupol was characterized by its brutality and utter disregard for civilian life. Russian forces indiscriminately shelled residential areas, hospitals, and shelters, trapping families in collapsed buildings and basements with dwindling supplies of food, water, and medicine. Despite facing overwhelming firepower and dwindling supplies, Ukrainian soldiers and volunteer fighters, including members of the Azov Regiment, a controversial nationalist militia unit, fought tenaciously to defend Mariupol, holding out for weeks against repeated Russian assaults. Their heroic stand, in the face of insurmountable odds, became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance and a source of national pride. The siege of Mariupol reached a tragic climax in May 2022, when the remaining Ukrainian defenders, holed up in the Azovstal steel plant, a sprawling industrial complex that had become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, were forced to surrender after weeks of relentless bombardment. The fall of Mariupol, a strategic victory for Russia, came at a horrific human cost, leaving the city in ruins and its surviving population traumatized by the horrors they had endured. While the world's attention was focused on the sieges of Kiev and Mariupol, a fierce battle was raging for control of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, located just miles from the Russian border. Kharkiv, a predominantly Russian-speaking city with deep historical and cultural ties to Russia, was seen as a key objective for the invading forces, who believed they would be welcomed as liberators. However, the Russian military's expectations of a swift victory in Kharkiv proved to be disastrously misguided. The city's residents, far from welcoming the invading forces, mounted a spirited defense, taking up arms alongside Ukrainian soldiers and territorial defense units. The battle for Kharkiv, like the battle for Kyiv, became a symbol of Ukrainian resilience and a testament to the failure of Russia's military strategy. The fighting in Kharkiv was particularly brutal, characterized by street-to-street combat and indiscriminate shelling that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. The city's infrastructure, including its power grid, water supply, and transportation system, was severely damaged, leaving residents without access to basic necessities. Despite facing constant bombardment and the threat of encirclement, Ukrainian forces managed to hold off the Russian advance, eventually pushing the invading forces back from the city center. The battle for Kharkiv, while far from over, marked a significant setback for the Russian military and a morale-boosting victory for Ukraine. As Russian forces withdrew from areas around Kyiv in late March and early April 2022, the world bore witness to the horrific aftermath of their occupation. In the town of Bucha, a quiet suburb northwest of the capital, evidence emerged of widespread atrocities committed against Ukrainian civilians, sending shockwaves through the international community and galvanizing support for Ukraine. The images that emerged from Bucha were harrowing bodies of civilians, some with their hands bound, lying dead in the streets, many bearing signs of torture and execution-style killings. Eyewitness accounts from survivors painted a grim picture of life under Russian occupation, marked by fear, intimidation, and indiscriminate violence against unarmed civilians. The atrocities in Bucha, along with similar reports emerging from other liberated towns and villages, sparked international outrage and condemnation. Western leaders accused Russia of war crimes and called for investigations into the killings. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, opened an investigation into alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, including the killings in Bucha. The Bucha massacre, as it came to be known, became a turning point in the war, hardening international resolve to hold Russia accountable for its actions and increasing pressure on Western governments to provide Ukraine with greater military support. The Russian invasion of Ukraine triggered an unprecedented response from the international community. Western governments, led by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, imposed a series of crippling economic sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, energy sector, and oligarchs close to Putin. The sanctions were designed to cripple the Russian economy and pressure Putin to end the war. They included freezing the assets of Russian banks, banning Russian oil and gas imports, and restricting the export of high-tech goods to Russia. The sanctions, while having a significant impact on the Russian economy, have so far failed to deter Putin from pursuing his military objectives in Ukraine. In addition to sanctions, Western countries have provided Ukraine with billions of dollars in military aid, including weapon systems, ammunition, and intelligence support. The United States, in particular, has played a leading role in supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and HIMARS rocket systems. The global response to the war in Ukraine has been significant, demonstrating a remarkable degree of international unity in the face of Russian aggression. However, the conflict has also exposed divisions within the international community, with countries like China and India refraining from condemning Russia's actions. As the war in Ukraine grinds into its second year, it has morphed into a brutal war of attrition, with neither side able to achieve a decisive military victory. Front lines have hardened, particularly in the eastern Donbas region, where both sides are engaged in fierce fighting for control of key towns and cities. The war has taken a heavy toll on both sides. Thousands of soldiers have been killed, and countless others have been wounded. The civilian population has borne the brunt of the suffering, with millions displaced from their homes and struggling to survive amidst the ruins of their cities and towns. The conflict has also had a profound impact on the global economy, disrupting supply chains, driving up energy prices, and exacerbating food insecurity in many parts of the world. The war has exposed the fragility of the post-Cold War order and raised fears of a wider conflict between Russia and the West. As the war drags on, the prospects for a negotiated settlement seem increasingly distant. Both sides remain entrenched in their positions, with little appetite for compromise. The war in Ukraine has become a dangerous stalemate, with no end in sight. A fractured world. Shifting alliances. The war in Ukraine has profoundly fractured the international system, shattering the post-Cold War consensus and revealing a world increasingly divided along geopolitical fault lines. The conflict has forced nations to reassess their alliances, priorities, and their place in a rapidly changing global order. The invasion of Ukraine has drawn a sharp line between those who condemn Russia's actions as a blatant violation of international law and those who have either remained silent or offered tacit support for Moscow. Western nations, led by the United States and its European allies, have presented a united front in condemning the invasion, imposing sanctions, and providing military assistance to Ukraine. However, many countries in the global south, particularly those with historical ties to Russia or those wary of Western dominance in international affairs, have adopted a more nuanced stance. Some have abstained from voting on UN resolutions condemning the invasion, while others have called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict without explicitly condemning Russia's actions. This divergence of views reflects the complex geopolitical realities of the 21st century, where alliances are fluid and national interests often trump shared values. The war in Ukraine has exposed the limits of international cooperation and the challenges of upholding a rules-based order in a world increasingly defined by great power competition. NATO's resolve. A bulwark against aggression. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has breathed new life into NATO, the Western military alliance formed in the aftermath of World War II to counter the Soviet Union. Once seen by some as a relic of the Cold War, NATO has emerged as a pivotal actor in the Ukrainian crisis, providing military support to Ukraine, bolstering its presence in Eastern Europe, and serving as a deterrent against further Russian aggression. The invasion has galvanized NATO members, prompting them to increase defense spending and reaffirm their commitment to collective defense, enshrined in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This renewed sense of purpose has been evident in NATO's rapid response to the crisis, deploying additional troops and equipment to Eastern Europe to reassure allies and deter further Russian aggression. The war has also underscored the importance of NATO's open-door policy, which allows for the admission of new members as a tool for deterring Russian expansionism. Finland, historically neutral, joined NATO in April 2023, and Sweden is actively seeking membership, driven by security concerns in the wake of Russia's aggression. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated that NATO remains an indispensable security provider in Europe, capable of adapting to new challenges and deterring aggression from revisionist powers like Russia. The alliance's continued relevance and unity will be crucial in shaping the security landscape of Europe and beyond in the years to come. The European Union, united in response. The European Union, often criticized for its perceived bureaucratic inertia and internal divisions, has surprised many with its swift and united response to the war in Ukraine. The conflict has galvanized the bloc, prompting it to take unprecedented measures in support of Ukraine, including providing financial assistance, welcoming refugees, and imposing sanctions on Russia. The EU has provided billions of euros in financial assistance to Ukraine, helping to keep its economy afloat amidst the devastation of war. The bloc has also opened its borders to millions of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the conflict, providing them with temporary protection, access to healthcare, and other forms of support. Perhaps most significantly, the EU has joined the United States and other allies in imposing unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, energy sector, and individuals close to the Kremlin. These sanctions, while controversial and not without their economic costs for Europe, have dealt a significant blow to the Russian economy and demonstrated the EU's resolve to hold Moscow accountable for its actions. The war in Ukraine has been a defining moment for the European Union, testing its unity, resolve, and commitment to its founding principles. The bloc's response, while not without its flaws and challenges, has demonstrated its ability to act decisively in times of crisis and its commitment to defending the rules-based international order. Section 4. Global Repercussions: Energy, Food, and Inflation. The war in Ukraine has had profound global repercussions, disrupting energy markets, exacerbating food insecurity, and fueling inflation worldwide. The conflict has exposed the interconnectedness of the global economy and the ripple effects of conflict in a world already grappling with the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of energy, grains, and other commodities, and the war has disrupted these flows, sending shockwaves through global markets. Energy prices, already rising before the invasion, have soared to record highs as Western sanctions on Russian oil and gas exports have tightened global supplies. The war has also exacerbated food insecurity, particularly in developing countries that rely heavily on grain imports from Russia and Ukraine. The conflict has disrupted planting and harvesting seasons, blocked export routes, and driven up prices, putting millions at risk of hunger and malnutrition. The combined effects of rising energy and food prices have fueled inflation worldwide, eroding purchasing power and creating economic hardship for households and businesses alike. Central banks have responded by raising interest rates, but this risks slowing economic growth and potentially triggering a recession. The war in Ukraine has exposed the vulnerabilities of the globalized economy and the interconnected nature of global challenges. Addressing these challenges will require international cooperation and a coordinated response to mitigate the economic fallout of the conflict and address the root causes of instability and conflict. 'The Section 5. A New World Order? Uncertainty and transformation. The war in Ukraine has accelerated geopolitical realignment, eroded trust between major powers, and ushered in an era of heightened uncertainty and risk. Section 1. The Unfolding Humanitarian Crisis. A Sea of Displacement. The war in Ukraine has triggered a humanitarian crisis, uprooting millions and leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and uncertain futures. Section 2. Scars of War. Trauma and loss. The psychological trauma inflicted on Ukraine is profound, leaving an enduring legacy of pain, loss, and uncertainty. Section 3. Resilience and Resistance. The human spirit endures. Amidst the devastation, stories of extraordinary resilience, courage, and compassion continue to emerge from Ukraine. Section 4. Echoes of War. The impact on Russian society. The war in Ukraine has cast a long shadow over Russian society, exposing deep divisions and testing its social fabric. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, its future trajectory remains shrouded in uncertainty. Predicting the conflict's outcome is fraught with complexities and subject to geopolitical maneuvering. The path to peace in Ukraine hinges on the elusive prospect of a negotiated settlement. Both sides remain locked in a battle of wills, each demanding concessions the other seems unwilling to provide. Section 3. A World Transformed, the Enduring Legacy of War. The war in Ukraine will cast a long shadow over the 21st century, shaping the global order and redefining international relations. Section 1. The Global Reckoning. A World Transformed. The war in Ukraine serves as a stark reminder of the enduring power of history and the deep-seated grievances that can erupt with devastating consequences. Section 2. The Unfinished Business of Peace-Seeking Resolution. As the war in Ukraine enters its third year, the question of how to bring about a just and lasting peace remains elusive. Section 3. The Indomitable Spirit. Lessons from Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, for all its horror and devastation, has revealed not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the heights of human resilience, the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure, to resist, and to hope, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. The Ukrainian people, thrust onto the front lines of a conflict they did not choose, have demonstrated extraordinary courage, unity, and determination in defense of their homeland, their way of life, their right to exist as a free and independent nation. Their resistance, fierce and unwavering, has inspired the world, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can shine through. The war has also revealed the power of solidarity, the importance of international cooperation and support in the face of aggression and injustice. The global response to the conflict, while not without its flaws and inconsistencies, has demonstrated that the world is not indifferent to the plight of the Ukrainian people that the bonds of humanity can transcend borders and ideologies. The war in Ukraine, while a tragedy for all involved, offers valuable lessons for the world. Lessons about the importance of unity, the strength of resilience, and the need for unwavering commitment to the principles of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. These lessons, if heeded, can guide us toward a future where peace prevails, where justice triumphs, and where the human spirit, in its indomitable capacity for hope and renewal, ultimately prevails.